So for many of us, some of the most difficult conflicts, even the presumably political ones, happen in our own families. This is true for me as well. There's a particular incident that happened a few years ago when I was at home in Ohio. The entire family was in my mom's kitchen, and we found out that there had been yet another mass shooting. Now, my immediate reaction was empathic. I began to think about what it must be like to be a family member of someone who had been lost in such a violent way, the absolute grief and sorrow that they must be feeling. I was thinking about what it would be like to be a police officer or a medical emergency responder called to such a horrific scene, and the powerlessness they must feel in the face of that kind of violence. I was kind of awash in sorrow until a particular member of my family, who had gone on his social media feed, announced to all of us that the entire thing was a conspiracy anyway, that we had all been misinformed. It was a false flag event, master manipulated in order to make all of us have sympathy toward gun control. Instantly, all my sorrow turned to complete and total rage. I could not muster up a single thought of compassion, kindness, humility, respect, or love. It was not there. All I could think of was, you complete idiot. You complete idiot. What makes you think that some unknown guy sitting on his phone in a state thousands of miles away knows more about this event than the professional reporters and police officers at the scene? What are you thinking? I was ready to go all in. And then I heard the voice of Jesus. And Jesus said, "Don't you think he knows you? Don't you think he thinks you're an idiot who believes false sources?" Yeah, he probably does. Would it be helpful for him to share that opinion of you in this moment right now? No, probably not. Would you feel educated? Would you learn something from his sharing of this opinion? Nope. No, I sure wouldn't. So I had to take a pause and listen to Jesus for just a moment. More on that story a little bit later. Conflicts like this and so many others are everywhere, aren't they? Whether we like it or not, conflict is a huge part of life. Now, some people seem to really believe that conflict is constructive, a positive thing that can lead to growth and good outcomes. Here's a few quotes about that. For good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, and debate. This is from Margaret Heffernan. Here's another one from William Ellery Channing. Difficulties are meant to rouse, not discourage. The human spirit is to grow strong by conflict. Last one, and I'm going to admit this, I'm quoting Brad Pitt this morning. Happiness is overrated. There has to be conflict in life. So what do we think about this? Those who think that conflict is a healthy, invigorating part of human relationships that leads to growth and great alternative solutions, raise your hand. Awesome, there are a few of us. How many of us would say, yeah, we know conflict is kind of inevitable, but we sure don't like it? Yeah, right? Conflict is hard because here's the thing. Every time we have experienced conflict in life, somebody has lost something, right? And maybe it's us. Conflict involves loss for most of us, or the fear of loss. Maybe we'll lose a reputation. Maybe we'll lose relationship. Maybe we'll lose something we value. Maybe we'll lose an important resource that keeps us safe and secure. Conflict involves a sense of loss, a fear of loss, and nobody likes to lose. It is absolutely universal. So because conflict involves fear of loss for us, we usually have two basic reactions. First reaction is avoid conflict at almost any and all costs. So people who do this, right, basically just sublimate all their feelings, all their thoughts of disagreement, and they walk away and try to just manage all by themselves, right? Just keep it silent. Takes two people to tango. I'm never going to tango, and therefore we're never going to have a fight, right? The other reaction is, it is game on. A fight is about to happen, and there is no way I'm going to lose. I am going to fight to the death. If we're going to have an argument of words, it is going to be a debate to persuade or discredit. If it's about resources, I'm getting mine, don't care about you. Two fundamental reactions. No conflict, avoid it completely. Game on, somebody's going to lose and it's not going to be me. Both of these ways of dealing with conflict are not very God-centered. One requires us to disrespect ourselves by constantly denying what we really think and feel. The other tells us to disrespect other people, to even be willing to do them harm. God requires a much more complicated third way. It's challenging. It's complex. It takes a really long time to even begin to engage it. And most of us would probably just wish faith would fix it. We could just pray for a peaceful world and suddenly it would be peaceful, right? I mean, that's what we wish for. It sounds so simple. God would just magically make it so. But if the Bible is any indication of basic human nature, and I'm going to say it is, conflict is just a part of life, even for good, faithful people. There is not a single book in the Bible that doesn't deal with conflict. From Genesis to the very end, there is conflict in all of it. In fact, probably the epic and most archetypal conflict of all occurs in Genesis chapter 4. It's the story of Cain and Abel. We remember that from Sunday school days, right? Cain and Abel, two brothers. One is a farmer and one is a shepherd. Now, the Bible paints their conflict as familial and very personal, but actually, historically, shepherds and farmers, they had a huge social, economic, political conflict because they were vying for the same physical resources, right? So this was a huge conflict at the time in general. The Bible tells the story from a deeply personal perspective. Cain and Abel are brothers. And Cain believes that Abel is favored by God unfairly. Abel is getting all sorts of blessings and resources that Cain deserves, right? Cain is working hard. He's toiling and not getting any reward for this labor. And he believes that God is responsible for it. So what does he start to do? He has some assumptions about his brother and about God. The assumptions about him lead to resentment and envy and jealousy. And from that resentment and envy and jealousy, there is conflict and hate. And eventually, as we know, Cain kills Abel. And when God confronts him, he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The most primordial, archetypal conflict of all. And it's not just Cain. There is something in all of us, something about that cycle that seems to be at the root of most human conflict, whether it's interpersonal or much larger. We tell a story about the other. We make assumptions about them, true and false assumptions. We build resentments. We have envy and jealousy. They've got something that I want, or they're about to take something I have. We have hate. Hate leads to hate speech, and eventually, maybe actual physical conflict. It's the fundamental story of our human conflict. In fact, Pastor Adam Hamilton calls it the Cain syndrome. It's in our human nature. The Bible begins with this conflict, but it continues with David and Goliath, Esther and the king, Jesus and the Pharisees. In the book of Acts, we have the Apostle Paul, who's working alongside his friend and missionary Barnabas, and their disagreement becomes so sharp, they part ways. They can't even work together anymore. They have such a conflict. Paul devotes 4 chapters of the letter to the church of Romans to try to address all of their disagreements, all their divisions, all of their arguments with one another. 1 Corinthians 13, that beautiful ode to love that we read at every wedding. It is actually an attempt to try to stop fighting and bitterness and feuding in a church. It's a conflict strategy. All of that love is patient and kind and doesn't boast or insist on its own way. It's because the church in Corinth, they kept looking at each other and going, I don't like your spiritual gift. It's not very good. Your spiritual gift, not as good as mine. God likes me better. And guess what? There was conflict. And this was Paul's attempt to stop the resentment before it turned to hate, before it turned to something worse. And we have this beautiful chapter from Philippians, chapter 4. It sounds like angels singing, doesn't it? It's so saintly. Rejoice in the Lord always. Give thanks in all circumstances. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Peace, the peace of God that surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts. Whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is good and true, focus on these things. I mean, can you hear the heavens opening? If we lived like this, wouldn't the world be grand? What we forget when we hear these words is, again, the context. And the context is that Syntyche and Euodia are engaged in such a bitter feud that they are about to destroy the entire church. This is, again, a conflict strategy for people that are arguing and bitter. So we have to read Philippians in that light. I think Paul is offering us some really Christ-centered strategies for handling disagreements in ways that can be a little more constructive. So the first thing that he does is he refuses to escalate the conflict by demonizing either woman. He does not paint either one of them as bad or wrong in the midst of this disagreement. In fact, he comes in and says, I want to praise both of you. You are so wonderful. You have worked alongside me and others in sharing the gospel. You are co-workers at my side. You are phenomenal followers of Jesus Christ. He praises them, and he reminds them of what they have in common. They have Jesus in common. They have the church in common. He tries to take their identity out of this level of juggernauts towards something higher, their higher identity in God. It's why he tells them to have the same mind as Christ. He's trying to elevate the entire conversation beyond this one particular argument. So the very first thing he does is he refuses to demonize either side in the argument, and he takes them to a higher common ground. He also refuses to gossip or take sides in the story. Not only is no one painted as good or bad, no one is painted as right or wrong. He takes no sides at all. Surely he knows what this argument is about. He's writing this letter because the congregation has written to him and said, we need some serious help here. There is an argument that's tearing us apart. He doesn't refer to the details at all. Apparently, he thinks that they don't really matter. What matters is that everyone comes together and work toward reconciliation and peace. I think what he does is he humanizes everyone in the process. He remembers that these women are more than the conflict. They are full human beings, and he wants them to remember that as well. When we are in conflict with other people, particularly if it's bitter, if it's gone on for a long time, we often paint that other person as a caricature, not a real human. They're just a caricature of evil and bad and all things we don't like. I mean, that is absolutely what we see happening in our culture and our political system, isn't it? Like, no matter which side you're talking about, the other is a caricature of evil, not a full human being. Now, that's easy to do when we don't know people, when it is just cultural leaders. But we do it with one another interpersonally as well, don't we? That disagreement can become all that we see. We're invited by our faith to step back just a little bit and remember that that person that we are engaging with is a child of God, and we know more about them than the disagreement that we're in. Remember what respect means? It means to look and to look again, to deeply observe. That's what we're asked to do in the middle of conflict, not just to focus on this thing that's causing our disagreement, but to look deeper, to look further, to look into the humanity of another person. I would call it sacred curiosity. In the middle of an argument, especially if you reach a point where you just realize, we're not going to see eye to eye. It's just not going to happen here. We are on uncommon ground. You can choose to ask questions. You can ask things like, I'm curious how you arrived at that opinion. I'm curious if you had an experience that helped shape that belief. Can you tell me more about that? It helps us get out of that constant need to debate, to be right. It gets us back into relationships. It gets us back to that place of respect for another human being, a human being that God has created. And we are required to respect what God has made. I'm not saying that we should respect harmful ideas. We shouldn't. There are harmful ideas out there in the world. We hear them. We're not asked to feign respect and say that we think they're a good idea. We're asked to look beyond that opinion or position, to engage in a different way. I think it requires us to pause, to really remember that we aren't positions and policies. We're people. We are people made by God in the image of God. It allows us to pause and also respect ourselves and remember that it's not just Cain living in here. Christ is in here too. And we can choose. We can choose how we engage one another. We can learn to ask other questions other than just fight it out because we want to win no matter what. Which kind of brings me back to that scene in my mother's kitchen. I took a big, deep breath, which is the sound of a human being swallowing their pride and allowing themselves to be filled with the Holy Spirit. I went, okay, it's not going to help to say what I really want to say. Maybe this guy isn't as much of an idiot as I think he is, because I am for sure not as much of an idiot as he thinks I am. Right? and I decided to ask some questions. I just said, what do you know about your source? What makes you think he's trustworthy? And it started a conversation, and I wasn't satisfied with the answers, but that's okay. What happened is that I learned, we all learned, and there was not a showdown in my mother's kitchen in which someone didn't survive, right? We made it. We made it to another day because we chose a little bit of respect, if not for one another's ideas, at least for our humanity and our relationship. There's a little bit of Cain in all of us. There is. But Christ is present too. And if we listen, he will always say, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Pray for those who persecute you. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Amen.